This is somewhat of an uncomfortable conversation to have, but what was the turning point for you where you were like, okay, this is a genocide?
Yeah, I mean, before October 7th, I would have agreed certainly that Israel was an apartheid state. I don't agree that the goal of that state was the extermination of the Palestinians. I think the goal of a strong and rising faction in Israel, and it's been in control for a long time, has been the complete kind of destruction of the Palestinians as an independent political force, which is an element of genocide. Hey, how you doing, son?
What's going on, Matt? Pleasure to have you on the broadcast. Welcome to the HasanAbi broadcast. Here it is, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, Matt Duss. As I said earlier, a second ago, Matt Duss is the former foreign policy advisor to Bernie Sanders and now currently working at the Center for International Policy. Matt, someone called you evil yesterday, for the record. That's how I presented you. And it reminded me that I was meaning to have you on the broadcast to talk about both the Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin summit that is supposed to be taking place tomorrow, but then also talk to you about Democrats, their failures on Israel-Palestine, your opinion and your evolved opinion on Israel-Palestine personally, and you know what happened, like how that attitude change took place for you. Maybe that can be instructive for others as well, and numerous other things that we can talk about. And I'm very excited to have you here. Thank you for coming on.
Oh, glad to be here. Thanks so much, man. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, you also are a Sam Cedar acolyte as well, right? Or you go on the Majority Report every now and then.
Yeah, I like to refer to myself as one of his designated foreign policy nerds. So
yeah,
that is one of the roles I play for Sam.
Hell yeah. Foreign policy advisor to Bernie Sanders, foreign policy advisor to Sam Cedar.
Yes.
Okay. I love Sam. All right. Well, Matt, we are actually currently talking about Pete Buttigieg's horrible response, or very Pete Buttigieg style response, if you will, to the question that came from the Podjohns on a podcast where they asked him, like, what do you think about Israel-Palestine? Like, what do you think about what's going on? And he gave this incredibly wishy-washy answer. Let's take a look real quick. I'm going to I'm going to share the screen with you as well so you can also see it. Where is it? Oh, here it is. Okay. And I'm going to, all right. And let's take a look.
More than half of Senate Democrats just voted to oppose the sale of over $500 million worth of U.S. bombs and guns to Israel. Would you have voted to oppose sending those weapons?
I think we need to insist that if American taxpayer funding is going to weaponry that is going to Israel, that is not going to things that shock the conscience. And look, we
as opposed to weapons that don't shock the conscience.
Yeah,
I love
upholding the law.
No, I love weaponry that doesn't shock the conscience, like when it's, specifically not baby melting weaponry. I mean, that's all weapons. That's what weapons are. Anyway, sorry.
We see images every day that shock the conscience. So much of this is complicated, but what's not complicated is that if a child is starving because of a choice made by a government, that is unconscionable. And I think especially including voices who care about Israel, who believe in Israel's right to exist, who have stood with Israel in response to the unbelievable cruelty and terrorism of October 7th. I think there's a reason why so many of those voices are speaking up now too, because this is not just something that is on its face and in itself a moral catastrophe. It is also a catastrophe for Israel for the long run.
How do you think the next administration?
So, Matt, you had until recently a different opinion, I think, right? If I'm not mistaken. I mean, you've been very progressive. You are a lot more progressive than the average person in American politics in terms of your analysis on Israel. But like, there have been some instances, I feel like, where I think we have a disagreement ultimately on like Zionism in general, probably a reasonable disagreement. But overall, if you don't mind elaborating on your position for the people that might not know, like what your take is on what is currently going on in Israel and Palestine, and then we'll talk about Pete as well.
Sure. No, I mean, I guess we may disagree on, Zionism or some other questions like that, but my position on, conditioning aid and stopping arms sales has been that we should do it for a
Yeah.
long time.
Yeah.
This going back many years. I mean, and the point is not just to kind of punish Israel; it's to uphold U.S. law, because
Yeah.
U.S. law like explicitly prohibits providing U.S. weapons to governments that are abusing human rights. And that's one of the weird things about Pete's answer is that like he answered the question even if he didn't intend to when he said that this government is making a choice to starve children. The law says that that's one of the things we cannot support, and
Yeah.
arms must immediately stop. So if he's familiar with the law, he should understand that he kind of answered his own question, even if unintentionally. In terms of things that we might disagree with, happy to chat about that. But like my own view, initially, going back for a long time, has been that the U.S.-Israel relationship is just completely bonkers. It exists in kind of this weird Alice in Wonderland. I was listening to your stream early on. The way we talk about this, like Steny Hoyer, that we could go on and on about this. It's
Yeah.
like, what the hell is he talking about?
Yeah.
No, in what reality is he looking at? The point is he's just not looking at reality, and there's an enormous kind of machinery of lobbying and advocacy and fundraising and kind of punishment and consequences imposed on anyone who wants to kind of tell the truth, and refuses to hew to the usual talking points that exist in Washington. But that's really changing. It's taken far too long for it to change, but I think the backlash that we've all seen, to Pete's comments, example, the fact that, as you said, the fact that he needed to clean this up. Pete may be making this decision because he's sensing a change in the weather, but that change in the weather is what's very important here. That's the result of not only of the inescapable, undeniable reality of starvation and genocide, but a movement that has been working very hard for many years to make presence felt and to be able to kind of, to apply pressure from the left. So it's not just coming from the right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that without so many people consistently mounting pressure everywhere around the globe, really, I don't think that we in a media environment where like someone like Pete Buttigieg would feel the need to go and course correct, which I thought was still, again, in classic Pete Buttigieg fashion, like some of the statements that he made in this political piece, were also incredibly bad. He did the classic, like, I would have signed Bernie Sanders' proposal, even though he didn't say it initially, right? Fine. But then he still turned around and still was like saying, oh, it's because it's important to clear something about this something this enormous and this painful. It's just that it's so enormous and it's so painful that sometimes words can fail. It's like your job is a communicator. That's what you're billed as. You're like the main communicator of like establishment Democrats. You're the voice of the establishment Democrats who can actually show a young face, some kind of dynamism that like these guys are desperate for, right? And I think they're looking for they're looking at all the wrong reasons why Zoran won, and they think like maybe Pete Buttigieg could be the type of Zoran-style candidate for third-way neoliberalism, and the continued American foreign policy bipartisan consensus that we see, which is like permanent war, constant, endless increase to military funding. And, Pete Buttigieg is clearly falling short of that. But there are still so many worse people out there. I talked to Rashida Tlaib at the DSA National Convention this past weekend, and she brought up an interesting perspective. And you've been in D.C., you've been in these circles for a very long time, so I want to hear your perspective on this as well. There is an attitude outside of DC, outside of this little bubble that exists that dominates our lives, that like either politicians are cynical and doing this because they are either like blackmailed into this position, or and this is like varying degrees of like anti-Semitic conspiracy as well, Jewish hypnosis, things of that nature, all the way to they are tunneled in on unlimited support to Israel and loyalty to the Israeli state and unconditional aid permanently to the Israeli state because of their because of the pervasive influence of the pro-Israel lobby and numerous other advocacy groups. Which side do you fall on? If we were to present it as like Noam Chomsky, who says Israel is an extension of American imperialism and profoundly important, versus it's the lobby, the Mersheimer perspective. Where do you see yourself on that equation?
I mean, I'm not. I hope I'm not like avoiding the question by saying it is a little bit of both. And I mean, so I'll talk about them both. I mean, first off, yes, of course, the Israel lobby, AIPAC, is very influential, and they're partly influential, for a few reasons. One is Americans just generally who don't think about foreign policy a lot, and that's a lot of Americans, and that's no ding on them. People have things that are more important to them and more immediate than thinking about foreign policy. But for a lot of folks, especially folks who in the Christian community, and this is where I came from, I grew up in the evangelical community. There is something important, like the U.S.-Israel relationship is founded in a very important historical narrative for them, part of Christians' culture. They understand the story of the Old Testament as part of the Christian Bible in a way that they don't identify with stories and histories and narratives of others in the region, certainly the Palestinians. And that's not a value judgment. That's just something that for a huge number of Americans, even who don't know a lot about the region, about foreign policy, they identify with this one country because they learned about it in Sunday school.
Yeah.
And so that's the kind of political basis on which the pro-Israel lobby is operating. You add to that American politics is deeply corrupt. The influence of money it's a complete outlier among developed democracies, the extent to which wealthy interests are able to kind of game the system and achieve influence just by spending huge sums of money. And the pro-Israel lobby is very effective at using huge sums of money to reward and punish. I mean, that's what a lot of about, pleasure and pain, rewards and punishments. And that's how you end up, with people like Steny Hoyer. I mean, Steny Hoyer is not saying anything that he doesn't believe. He does believe these things, but part of the strategic use of campaign funds and donations and lobbying is to make sure people who believe things like Steny Hoyer are the people who end up in leadership positions in the Democratic Party, and that people who want to take a bit different view always run into trouble, and they're going to face lots of fundraising challenges, and they'll probably face well-funded challengers in their primaries. So the system, unfortunately, kind of selects or a set of beliefs that are pleasing to high-powered, well-funded lobby groups. And the last thing I'll say here is, and this goes to what Chomsky was saying, yeah, I mean, there is a faction in Israel and in the United States, and this has really come to the fore lately with Israel essentially making war across the region and reestablishing itself as really kind of an unquestioned regional military hegemon with the backing of the United States. That there are folks in the United States and in Israel who see Israel as basically the United States' sheriff.
Yeah.
And this is not just about Israel; it's about sustaining America's primacy, sustaining America's global military hegemony. So it's not, and this is why I tend to recoil from when people say, "Oh, I mean, America is doing Israel's bidding." I mean, yes, Israel has enormous influence. I think way too much influence in Washington, but there is a shared kind of ideology that undergirds this. And I say, putting all of this on Israel kind of lets American policymakers off the hook.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with you. Matt, if you don't mind me, is there a way for you to shut off your noise gate? Because there are moments where you're like being a little bit quiet at the end of your statements, and then your microphone, unfortunately, your microphone unfortunately just like silences your voice, and people are having a hard time hearing like the end of your statements.
That better?
Well, we'll see. I'll let you know if while you're talking, if it happens again.
Right again.
But bringing it closer would probably be better, whichever microphone you're using.
Sorry,
yeah, it's worse now. Actually, it might be. Oh, you know what it is? Can you hear me still? I think. Well, you also turned off your camera. It might be because you're not actually using the microphone that's in front of you. The source might be your earbuds. That might be the reason. Also, Chad, I hope you guys are happy. You demanded this. I'm in real time. We're trying to make production changes, and now it's a little cooked. You got the Blue Yeti right in front of you. That microphone you have. I can't hear you at all now. Yeah, I've. Wait, I think you changed the source. You changed the source completely, and now it's wait.
All right, you got me now?
Oh, perfect. All right, let's see if it continues. Let's see if it works.
Yep.
Okay. I do suspect that there probably will still be noise gate issues. Okay. In any case, what were we talking about? We were talking about Israel's pervasive influence and network of pressure that is very successful. But politicians are the reason why I'm bringing this up is because like what Rashid Tlaib told me was basically that like politicians are still malleable, and it does seem like this unshakable force, like the loyalty and defense of Israel is just like impossible to break through. But it's very clear that, at least from her feedback, that they do see people at their town halls and they do get scared. And I think Gallego was a great example of this, like a person who has been pro-Israel in his town hall when faced with that question had to be like, oh, well, maybe I would have voted against weapons. There's also the other side of this where people talk about like the distinction between defensive weapons and offensive weapons. I wanted to hear your perspective on that.
Sure. Well, first, in regard to what Congresswoman Tlaib said, I mean, she's right. It is so important for members to kind of hear from constituents and to get grief and to get complaints. I mean, that's what I was saying earlier. That for the longest time, they've only ever felt like they had to fear pressure from their right. They've only been looking over their right shoulder when this question comes up, and it's because of a lot of work by a lot of people, activists and others, who that they understand like they need to check their left shoulder as well. And that Politico article that you quoted from, where Pete went to kind of clean up the mess. I mean, it's saying, this is going to be a litmus test going into 2028. And I think we saw from Mamdani's campaign something really important. There's a good reason why it's a litmus test, because it signals to people that you're not full of crap on a whole range of other issues. You can offer, a really fantastic platform, a whole set of great ideas. But if your answer to a question about Gaza is that Israel has the right to defend itself, you're basically telling people that I'm full of crap and I'll probably fold on all that other great stuff too. So it's a litmus test, I think, for a couple of really good reasons. So what was the second part of your question there?
The second part of my question was the distinction being made in some circles, at least, like between offensive and defensive weapons. Do you feel like this is a distinction without a difference?
I mean, I understand. Just you don't want to be. I mean, it's important to allow countries to defend themselves, to defend their civilians. We talk about that a lot with regard to Israel. It's a fair question. I think it's a very important question. Why do we never ask that of the Palestinians? Israel has a right to defend itself. Do the Palestinians have a right to defend themselves?
I say yes.
I think, yeah, absolutely. I think they absolutely do. I mean, they not only have a right to defend themselves, they have a right to resist occupation, as any people do.
No, it's both legal and moral, for sure.
That's right. They should do so within the bounds of international law, with the treatment of civilians and non-combatants, just as Israel should. But anyone should be able to answer unequivocally yes, that the Palestinians have a right to defend themselves. Now, going to this question of defensive versus offensive, I understand that Congresswoman, AOC got some grief for her vote and then for her explanation, and I understand people's concerns about that. My kind of question here is like, was it worth spending that much bandwidth on this amendment that was not going to pass at all? I don't think so. She ended up voting against the entire bill anyway. That was the right vote. And I think where people should focus.
Well, see, I agree with you. And I think the concern that I have isn't like, oh, AOCIA or whatever the fuck people say all the time in online circles. The concern I have is, and I think you'll agree with me on this, that there is a void in discourse right now with the way that the Democratic base feels. It's a 92-8 issue at this stage, right? And
Yeah.
that void is being experienced in every facets of American politics. Like there's independents are overwhelmingly seeing Israel in a disfavorable way. Even Republicans, by majority, regardless of their loyalty to Donald Trump, have had issues with Israel in ways that we've never seen in American politics before. So when the overwhelming public sentiment is, as I like to jokingly say, "fuck Israel o'clock," and the Democrats are completely unable to ride that wave, even on a partisan, even with a cynical, cold, calculated partisan analysis, I fear that void will be taken over by grifters and maybe even anti-Semitic people. And the Democrats are actually dropping the ball both politically and also on the policy front on this issue once again. I think AOC should be the person that is pushing for amendments like that. Do you disagree?
I don't know if that amendment is the one to fight on. I think there are a lot of great things that she's pushed, and she will. We're moving into the NDAA, this big defense authorization bill. I'm really interested to see what she's going to be offering there. I don't know if that one bill that Marjorie Taylor Greene offered was the kind of hill to fight on. I understand what people have concerned about it. I think there are smarter places to fight, but I would also say, people should understand, and I think most people do, that she's been one of the great champs on this. And I think it's fair to have disagreements and to question some of the choices she makes, but I also think it's important to keep that in mind. I mean, she has done enormous work.
Oh, for sure. She called it a genocide way before many people did in Congress.
Right.
And that should be recognized, and I definitely do recognize that, which is why I always think like it's inconsistent, even in the simplest terms. If you're like saying that this country is committing a genocide, but then you're also saying like, but we have to keep giving it weapons to allow itself to continue behaving in this belligerent way. Because that's my main point on this, is that like everyone, including Israeli society and Israeli officials, knows that without America's unlimited support in Israel's offensive capabilities and its defensive capabilities since October 7, 70% of all munitions that Israel has used has come from the United States of America, both on the defensive side and on the offensive side. We've moved our Navy around Israel's enemies and around Israel's allies as well, in an effort to defend Israel whenever there's retaliation from countries or militancy groups that have the capacity to resist against Israel or to fight back. And in that process, like, I think we're giving Israel bandwidth to continue behaving in this belligerent way, and defensive weapons, I think, play a formative role in this.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, and also, I get that, money is fungible, and money they are getting for, quote unquote defensive weapons is money that they don't have to, that they can then spend on offensive weapons. So, I get those arguments. Yeah. I guess what I would say is that it's fine to disagree with the vote and disagree with her explanation, but I also think in terms of, where we're focusing our energy and where activists are focusing their energy, it's rather than going after her, it's like, I want more people to be voting against the offensive weapons,
Yeah. No, and the other thing that I also am finding myself consistently trying to get politicians on the Democratic side to like advocate for is that if they lead on this issue and even are unafraid to take bold and, dare I say, radical, I guess, stances on issues like this, they will immediately move the Overton window and they will immediately move the Overton window in a more positive direction. What I mean by this is, if congressional leaders that are the most progressive right now were running around talking about no more weapons to Israel at all, and maybe even a sanctions package to Israel, if that was the advocacy that you heard from the Bernie Sanders and the AOCs of the world, and like bold and progressive policymakers, then I think more moderate parts of the Democratic Party would inevitably try to find a centrist position and retriangulate their perspective, instead of just like continuing to say like, oh, well, we don't know if we can stop giving weapons to Israel. That's just the way I see it. I think that that's part of the reason why the Republicans have dominated discourse on every issue, both domestic and foreign policy, in perpetuity, because they're unafraid to be radical.
I mean, don't get me. I'm with you on that. I mean, we need kind of bolder, more courageous leadership on a whole range of issues. So I agree there. But I'll say just on this one issue, I mean, even that Politico article, the fact that Pete was even asked about banning arms sales is because of Bernie's resolutions. These joint resolutions of disapproval that Bernie introduced and it was voted on a few weeks ago. It got the most votes from any from Democrats ever. I think it was 27 for one, 24 for another. Both of them more than half of the Democratic caucus in the Senate. Still too few, in my view. I mean, this should have, when you look at the reality of the genocide and what's being done with our weapons, I mean, we should have stopped these arms sales a long, long time ago. But still, recognizing the weird way that this issue works, I think it is important to chalk that up as an important achievement. But also, one of the achievements was getting, potential candidates for 2028 to have to answer, what would you have done? Senator Alyssa Slotkin, who managed not to be there for the vote, she had to answer the question, would you have voted for it? Gallego, also not there, had to answer the question. This is going to keep coming up. It's going to be a question that's going to be asked to every candidate who wants to run in the 2028 primary, and that's important.
Yeah. This is not only a litmus test for upcoming elections, but I think this was a litmus test in many ways for the previous election as well. And I wanted to hear your perspective on this, because a lot of people, I think, falsely, claimed that the left was a single issue on this, right? And that the left was responsible for the defeat of Kamala Harris, which, of course, if you actually look at the numbers, like Jill Stein and all the other, third-party spoilers that are supposed to be on the left flank, did not actually make up for the margin of defeat anyway. So it's objectively false to make this claim. But I think that a lot of people, including those who I talked to, including the Pod Johns that I talked to before the election and the lead up, when I was like ringing the alarm bells about this issue, actively avoided it. And I think it was actually deliberately cut out of their autopsy on why the campaign failed as well, like this issue in particular, because people's attitudes about what's going on in Gaza and about what Israel is doing did not dramatically swing overnight. There were numerous polls that showed that denying weapons to Israel and forcibly implementing a ceasefire would have been a very important issue that Kamala Harris could deviate away from the Biden regime on, and yet she failed to do so. So what is your assessment on this?
Yeah, and I'll just say there's been polling. I remember there's one poll that came out in 2019 by the Center for American Progress, where I used to work years and years ago. But I say that because, the Center for American Progress is a very closely party-aligned think tank, and they put out a poll that showed a majority of Democrats in 2019 supported, blocking aid, conditioning aid. So this has been a majority position among Democratic voters for more than 2 election cycles now. It's now a super majority that supports this, and for very understandable reasons. Now I don't know that I know that the Pod Save guys have actually covered Gaza and Palestine quite a bit. I do want to recognize that. And going back to 2019, it was actually, they hosted a series of talks at the J Street conference where Bernie came out and declared, conditioning aid. Warren came out. Buttigieg came out and declared support for it for like 2 weeks until he got some pushback. And so that's when he kind of moved off it. So going to Harris, what I'll say is this, like I said about, why it's a litmus test. I think it's impossible to say, the actual, down to the decimal point, what impact Gaza made on her loss. I think there is no question that it played a role, not just among voters for whom that is a priority issue. And, to people who criticize, the left for being, one issue on Gaza, I'm like, being one issue on a genocide, I think that's a fairly decent thing to be one issue about. The fact that your government is supporting a genocide in front of our eyes. But it was
Ta-Nehisi Coates
also
said it best. He said, "A party that is unwilling to stop a genocide. What makes you think they are willing to defend democracy?"
right. That's exactly right, and that's also kind of what I was getting at. Is that even for people for whom Gaza and the issue of Palestinian rights is not a real priority, the fact that she couldn't give the bare minimum, that she couldn't depart from these pre-baked nonsense talking points about how too many Palestinians have died and we're all so sad to watch this happening day after day after day, as if we weren't, completely complicit in this happening, just signaled that she wasn't for real.
Yeah.
People are looking to be, they want to believe people. And she was not believable on this. And I think that, that signaled that she's probably not for real on a whole bunch of other things too.
Yeah. No, it was a perfect issue to show the problems that was emblematic within the entire Democratic Party's inability to listen to the demands being made by their base, their own base, that they were
Right.
so willing to throw them aside to say, we're not going to do anything on this. We're just going to stay the course and just feed a bunch of bullshit about how they're trying desperately to get a ceasefire deal done, when in fact everyone who was even like a little bit aware of what was going on would either get mad because they're like, what do you mean we can't get a ceasefire done? We're America, okay? Or or they just thought, okay, well, you're feckless, like you're unable to do this, like you're weak. Or of course they knew the truth, which was this is bullshit, which is what I want to ask you about, because I have tweeted a lot of things. I've said a lot of things about Israel and all of the militant resistance against Israel that oftentimes Zionists get very mad about. People that are doing Hasbara, people that are pro-Israel get very mad about. One of those is the notion that this conflict could end, this genocide could end at any given point with one phone call. And I wanted to hear, what your perspective is. You're a foreign policy guy. And if you think that, well, this is, of course, an exaggerated claim. It's not literally one phone call, but it's as close to one phone call as you can get in American politics. And it has ended with one phone call in the past, with George H.W. Bush, with the continuation of the settlement projects with Ronald Reagan, with Lebanon, and also with Joe Biden in 2021, with Israel's siege on Gaza in 2021. So what's your assessment on that?
Yeah, as you said, not one phone call, not one day, but as Joe Biden did in May 2021, he calls up Netanyahu and says, "We're out of runway here. We got to wrap this thing up." He never did that.
Yeah.
Here, and granted, the mood of Israel, the reaction to October 7th, this was a different situation, but still, after months and months and months of this, and knowing for a fact, and let's be clear, they knew for a fact what Israel was doing. They had complete visibility onto Israel's policy, its strategy, its tactics. And this is something I bring up a lot because I think it's important to note. The Biden administration assessed publicly that Russia was committing war crimes in Ukraine within a month of the February 2022 invasion. They could not, by the end of the Biden administration, after whatever it was, 18 months, they still could not come out with an assessment of Israel's, behavior in Gaza. That's just such bullshit. We have such absolute visibility, far greater visibility into Gaza, into Israel's tactics and what it's doing than we do into what Russia's doing. And the fact that they couldn't make an assessment, which everyone can see on their phones, literally everyone, Palestinians are reporting it.
USAID itself actually floated a report all the way up to Anthony Blinken, and he spiked it on purpose because he wanted to continue unlimited weapons to Israel.
That was not the only report. I know that, there were numerous people inside USAID, inside state, and, others outside the government who were reporting this, sounding the alarm, and they constantly, Blinken and Biden, because Biden had simply decided at the beginning, we're just going to support Israel. This is his long, deeply ideologically held view, that this is how the relationship works. And I do also, my understanding is that they actually thought, because Netanyahu kept telling them, that I'm gonna downshift. We're gonna start to wrap this thing up in the next couple months. And if you believe him once, okay. but they kept on getting screwed by Netanyahu, and I don't absolve them for that, because the idea that Joe Biden, like the greatest foreign policy president of all time, was going to keep getting fooled by this grubby crook Netanyahu, I just don't buy that.
Yeah, no, he was on it. He was invested in the continuation of Israel's slaughter, I think.
I mean, do I think that Biden just wanted to keep supporting what Israel was doing? I don't. I think when he came out and kind of proposed that ceasefire agreement in May of 2024, he really wanted that to happen. But the fact is, he was not willing to do what was necessary to actually make it happen, which was to make that phone call, to bring that pressure, to say to Netanyahu, we are stopping support for this. We're stopping military support. We're stopping intelligence support. We're going to stop giving you diplomatic cover. You're going to face all these consequences unless you do A, B, and C. And Joe Biden was just never willing to do that.
Yeah, which is why I say he wanted it to continue happening. And that's what I mean. I think, like, the way I look at it, I have a more simplified, maybe too reductive of a attitude on this kind of stuff, where I just think that, like, America's global power is waning, and I think that Israel is a profoundly important regional ally for American interests. Both because of that, Israel's been able to create this, like, pervasive network of influence peddling and pressure campaigns that have created this environment, both by way of the media and also by way of, like, lobbying efforts. It's created this information environment that is utterly at odds with what is going on the ground. And I thought that they could continue this going after October 7. But of course, with social media, it was impossible to maintain a pressure campaign or keep people in the dark. But I think the American foreign policy apparatus was of two minds. You had the State Department people that saw what happened, knew exactly what Israel was going to do, and thought from a position that is pro-American imperialism, not against, not anti-American imperialism. They thought, if we let Israel do this, they are going to fuck up the bag. They're going to ruin America's global standing. They're going to harm Israel's own global standing and make it a pariah state, which it has become. And therefore, it's going to make it harder for America to intervene in the events of the region. And then there were, of course, the other side that won, that said, fuck you. No, it won't. It doesn't matter. We're going to go full tilt into this final solution, this one large military incursion, ethnic cleansing, wholesale slaughter, campaign, so that Israel can grab as much land as it possibly can and have a stronger position of dominance in the region. And we all know which side won out. But I think that it is, albeit reductive, but, like, that's, I think, the actual assessment, the top-down actual assessment that took place in that situation.
I might disagree with some of the terminology there, but in general, I don't. I think you're right. I mean, you had people in the White House, particularly Brett McGurk, who was the National Security Council's director for the Middle East, who basically took that latter view. He kind of fashions himself as a realist, a hard-nosed realist. He's someone who knows very little about Israel, Palestine, who's very close to the Gulf regimes. He's someone who's very anti-Iran, and he was the one who was essentially, determining the policy within the boundaries that Joe Biden set, which, again, the boundaries that Joe Biden set were, we're just going to keep supporting Israel. If we have differences, we'll express those privately. We'll try to kind of encourage them not to kill so many people. But ultimately, you're right.
Yeah. And you said there was a terminology to disagree with. What in particular? Is it imperialism, or is it the utilization of the final solution?
I know that my understanding of this is that there were folks inside the White House who understood that this war was going to be absolutely brutal. I don't know if people in the White House understood how brutal it was going to be. I think, and in retrospect, people should have known, because Israeli leaders were saying this publicly. Anyone who doubts that can just look at the huge dossier that was assembled in the South African case made to the ICJ on genocide. but I'm cautious about saying that no, like the White House knew that this was just going to be an absolute genocide from the get-go. That's not a defense.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
I think
the reason why I guess like disagree with you on that is because one, I just don't think that they care, right? Like, I don't think that the American government cares when people are dying. They do care when there's pushback. They care when there is a environment of instability within the American public that see this and then like fight back against it, and then they have to like decide, do we actually change our foreign policy, or do we just like create an incredible environment of repression and suppression that violates constitutional protections afforded to every single person on U.S. soil, like the Trump administration is doing? And I think Biden also gave that runway as well. But they ultimately they just don't. I don't think that they care when people are dying. They care about the backlash more so than the actual. I mean, this is a government after all. That's my assessment.
Yeah, like, I think unfortunately that's fair. Because like I said, I think Joe Biden wanted a ceasefire, but he wasn't willing to do the things that I think were clearly necessary to achieve that ceasefire. So it's fair to ask, did he really want a ceasefire?
Yeah, like he at no point did he ever float any kind of cessation of weapons transfers beyond like the 2,000-pound bombs, which was like,
He just blurted out in the middle of an interview and was not in any sense kind of a planned strategy. So yeah,
and
you're
also
right.
completely went along with like some of the most insane claims that like Israel was making, and that I think had a dramatic shift in the way that the media covered it as well. Like after the Al Ahli hospital courtyard explosion, there were a lot of people who were like, Israel would never blow up a hospital. This must be the work of Palestinian Islamic Jihad or Hamas. And of course, we now look at that and realize how insane it was. But my point was, like, even back then, they had already struck the Al Ahli hospital 2 days prior with an artillery shell, right? Like, it's not beyond the pale for Israel to blow up a hospital. Because if I know that, and I'm some dumb guy who's 34 years old, who's like maybe a little bit invested in this stuff, and I've known about what was going on in the region for a while, like I just can't in good conscience assume that like brilliant foreign policy minds that are working in the White House that have dedicated their entire lives to this were completely oblivious to what Israel was going to inevitably do.
No, and the point you're making there, I mean, this is as bad as materially supporting the war was and is. In my view, just as bad was the propaganda campaign that the Biden administration waged on its behalf. I mean, this was a campaign of lies and disinformation that I think it was as bad as the lead up to the Iraq War. And I use that, and I'm very careful about saying that. But when you look at what we constantly heard from White House spokesman John Kirby, from people at the State Department, oh, we're not seeing evidence of these war crimes. Oh, we haven't finished our assessment. Oh, I mean, it was just such bullshit. And it played like a really, really just a really corrosive role, and was designed to play a role in suppressing Democratic pushback. And it helped lay the groundwork for the continuing denial of this genocide that we're seeing now. And this is again why, as critical as I was of the Biden administration and people inside for doing what they did, I am even more critical of them now for staying silent about it.
Yeah.
They're not in government anymore. You saw the intelligence.
Kamala Harris, in this political article we were looking at earlier, chose not to give an answer. And it's been like 8 months. She's out of office. She's a private citizen. If she considers what's going on to be unconscionable, even from a partisan position, she could be like, the Trump administration is doing something so awful. But no, the only voice that we hear from the Biden administration, with the exception of like a couple State Department spokespeople that have been like, yeah, we lied because that's my job, right? I think was it Matt Miller who came out and said something like that? It was crazy. It's been Anthony Blinken and it's been Brett McGurk, who, especially with the Iran strikes, he was all over that on CNN, talking about how great Donald Trump is, as a matter of fact. Like, what am I supposed to think? What are Americans supposed to think? That like Democrats are actually against this, or is this a total bipartisan consensus?
In fairness, and I don't want to. No one needs to be fair to Brett McGurk, but he's not even a Democrat. I mean, he's someone who was originally Republican and just stuck around from administration to administration. But yeah, the fact that he is now out there having overseen not just this catastrophe, but previous catastrophes, and is now kind of making bank as a CNN contributor on top of whatever consulting gigs he's lined up. I mean, this is like the embodiment of the corrupt foreign policy establishment. There it is, right in front of us. And until we change this equation and actually find a way to impose costs instead of grant rewards to these people, we're going to have a tough time changing it.
Yeah. So a couple of the questions I had for you in particular. What was the turning point for you, if you don't mind me asking? This is somewhat of an uncomfortable conversation to have, but what was the turning point for you where you were like, okay, this is a genocide? Because like I could tell you, for me, from the jump, I was like, Israel's an apartheid state. October 7 had numerous atrocities that unfolded during October 7. Israel is a Jewish ethno state. Like the project of Zionism relies, in my assessment, of propping up an in-group with the sole purpose of exterminating all of the out-groups, and that in-group being the ethno-religion of Judaism, and the out-group being Palestinians and Arabs and basically non-Jewish people that the Israeli government not so ironically, it calls Arabs, which includes even like Armenians, for example. Like they are under the demographic categorization of the Israeli state. They are considered and classified as Arabs if they are Christian or Muslim.
Yeah, I mean, before October 7, I would have agreed certainly that Israel was an apartheid state. I don't agree that the goal of that state was the extermination of the Palestinians. I think the goal of a strong and rising faction in Israel, and it's been in control for a long time, has been the complete kind of destruction of the Palestinians as an independent political force, which is an element of genocide.
Yeah.
Not just the physical destruction of a people in whole or in part, but a destruction of their ability to act as a political community. And I think that has only become, much, much more explicit, along with the physical destruction of tens of thousands of people and their homes since October 7. Now, onto the question of genocide, it seemed clear pretty early on, just from the statements from Israeli government officials, on top of the absolute brutality of the war, that it seemed likely that it was going in that direction. I think a couple things that really kind of pushed me in that direction. There was a piece in the New York Review of Books by Aryeh Nair. If you know him, he was one of the founders of Human Rights Watch, himself a Holocaust survivor. That piece really basically convinced me, because that piece, what that focused on was the denial of aid, the denial of food, the use of food and humanitarian aid as a weapon, which was clearly happening. Now, there's all kinds of other things you can add on top of that, just the massive destruction, the rules of engagement that don't even deserve to be called rules of engagement because they are so permissive. You're fine. They're fine with killing dozens of civilians, men, women, and children, if you're possibly going to get one guy who kind of stood near a Hamas rally 5 years ago. I mean, absolutely absurd. But saying it publicly as far as our organization, we made that decision back, I believe it was May, when the Gaza plan was announced, the plan to reoccupy Gaza and to essentially to corral the people into an ever tightening, smaller piece of land. I think it just became undeniable at that point that this was the intention. I have total respect and understanding for people who came to that conclusion and said so publicly before that, but just organizationally, that is when we decided that term was undeniably inappropriate.
Yeah. This is something that a lot of people that I talk to who are Palestinian or Arab or like very familiar with like a lot of what Israel has done in the region can't contend with. Where like I've had these conversations with like they'll be like, why is denial of aid the main thing? Because I think it's because like under, I guess, and this is a Western chauvinist framework for sure, but under like the assessments that Western nation states usually make, they can, no matter how brutal a bombing campaign is, they can try to fit it within the confines of plausible deniability. They can collateralize the civilians that are being deliberately and directly targeted. But denial of entry of any sort of aid to a captive civilian population, I think, is just like, there is no justification for it at all, which is precisely the reason why Israel tries to do the stupidest counter-narrative campaigns on this, saying Hamas is stealing the aid or whatever, when they are known to be utilizing ISIS affiliate groups from local tribes that are drug dealers, like the illiterate Abu Shabab, I think his name is, who is now in charge of the popular forces, as they call it. And they are the ones who are actually disruptive and causing chaos at the point of delivery. So it's in every aspect of Israel's campaign, I think, and that's precisely the reason why you sometimes see the killing fields, accidentally shooting and killing the World Central Kitchen aid workers that are engaging in deconfliction with the Israeli state, and they still get triple tapped on their convoy. So, and that is a byproduct. I think it's like it's a deliberate mechanism of chaos at every aspect, because the ultimate goal is the complete ethnic displacement of Palestinians, if not expulsion, but like the death and destruction of Palestinian lives, to make it
acting
impossible.
acting within a permission structure that the United States has helped create and enable over many, many years. Yes.
Yeah. So, on that front, I guess, like, because I wanted to see, like, you're a foreign policy guy. This is what you do. I wanted to see, like, what are some of the disagreements that we might have, and one I think is on the issue of Zionism in general, because as I said, I see Zionism as an ethno-supremacist ideology that is built around the extermination of the indigenous population that happens to be non-Jewish, like the in-group, out-group dynamic. And so therefore I see it as inherently fascist. And I feel like this is something that a lot of people refuse to reckon with. And I wonder if you have disagreements with this.
I mean, I would disagree with defining all of Zionism that way. I think the actual material reality, like Zionism as it exists in the world, unfortunately, I think reflects that. And people who are Zionists, I think, need to contend with that. But I think there are other forms of Zionism. I mean, there was a pretty serious debate going in the late 1800s into the early part of the 20th century. People who classified themselves as identified as Zionists, but there were questions over, do we need our own state? Can we form a community within an existing state? There were all kinds of questions about, okay, how do we relate to the indigenous population? Is it a Jewish ethno state? What does self-determination for Jews really require? And so that's how I would tend to define Zionism broadly. It's just the belief that the Jews are a people, and as a people have a right to self-determination. Now, others define, a right to self-determination in their historic homeland of Israel in the Middle East, a right to a Jewish ethno-state. People add all kinds of different details on that. But in understanding it in its broadest terms, I understand it as I said. I mean, I know I have really close friends who identify themselves as progressive Zionists, who would share a lot of our criticisms, and who live there and do this work under considerable pressure in trying to create a society that is equal, in which Jews and Palestinians are equal under the law. Some of them support two states, some of them support one state, some of them support one kind of confederal arrangement. But I do think there are people who identify strongly as Zionists, to whom your description of kind of an a violent ethno-eliminationist chauvinism doesn't really apply.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, if the impact and the ultimate reality that is unfolding is genocide in Gaza and pogroms in the West Bank with a deliberate attempt to inevitably implement the greater Israeli state project, which Benjamin Netanyahu has even pontificated on as recently as this past week, then the way I see it is just like the old understanding of Zionism. And I always go back to Albert Einstein on this, which, he was, I guess, such a Zionist initially that he was slated to be the president of Israel, the first president of Israel. And his attitude on this was that the brigades, the initial, the early Zionist brigades that turned into the Israeli Defense Force after the development of the nation state, when he saw the atrocities that were unfolding, when he caught wind of this, he wrote letters decrying that Irgun, Lihi, and even the Haganah, these militia movements were behaving exactly like the Nazis were. And I feel like someone who has that attitude that early on in the initial formation of the Israeli nation state, which came with the Nakba, an ethnic displacement campaign that was crafted with the deliberate interest of ethnically displacing 750,000 Palestinians from their villages, implies that, especially when you factor in Theodore Herzl or even Jabotinsky's assessments or David Ben-Gurion's statements about the indigenous population and what must be done with them, it comes across as though it's been marketing. It's been marketed as something different. And I think that social conditioning has played a major role in this, especially in the West, for American Jews as well as, of course, the evangelical Zionists, the evangelical Christian Zionists. But ultimately, it might, if it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, then it's probably not a chicken. We might be looking at a duck.
No, I mean, everything you said there is fair. I would also add, someone who might identify as a communist can defy communism in very basic terms, but if they're being honest about their ideology, they do need to contend with the reality of governments that identified as communists, like the Soviets, like the Chinese Communist Party, and some of the things that were carried out in communism's name. That doesn't mean that defines communism for all time. But if they're going to be honest about what their ideology means, they do have to grapple with actually existing communism. You can find other examples too.
I 100% agree with you. I think that it's very important to learn from the past mistakes of attempts towards developing communism, like the transitional socialist states, whether it be like USSR or existing transitional socialist states like the current formation in China. There are always going to be issues. There's always going to be mistakes, and some of them are going to be incredibly costly. Widespread famine is obviously a great example of this in terms of some of the major issues that existed. And I think people need to contend with that, certainly. But I just think ideologically, when we go back to like first principles, like the fundamentals of an ideology, not only just like the opinions of its initial movement leaders, but also in its implementation, it's I guess what I'm trying to say is not an accident that we have arrived at the current genocide that's going on, which many people are now recognizing as a genocide. It was an inevitability. And I would go so far as to say that we're experiencing something of the sort in America as well. This is something that I saw in Israel in I think it was a 2018 Supreme Court protests that were taking place, where you had liberal Zionists and progressive Zionists that were out in the streets and protesting against the Israeli state. And the Israeli state was using some of the mechanisms of enforcement that they routinely apply to the Palestinians on their own, their own Jewish citizens. And one thing that I saw in those protests was everyone was waving the Israeli flag, and one thing that they never wanted to contend with was the existing apartheid mechanisms, the violence of that enforcement, the notion that the IDF is actually a secular force for good. They could not contend with how this country was becoming even more right wing. And we have something similar here in America as well. Like, we leave a lot of these contradictions unaddressed, whether it be white supremacy, whether it be America's settler colonial history and this nation's founding. And I think if left unaddressed, it is inevitable that we will have a leader like Donald Trump. And if left unaddressed, it is inevitable that Israel will have Benjamin Netanyahu as the leadership again, and his coalition will become increasingly more reactionary and increasingly more violent. That's just the way I see it, and I think that's an extension of the ideology of Zionism, and it can masquerade as like trying to find a homeland for people that have withstood tremendous amounts of oppression, historic pogroms, the Holocaust, unimaginable pain for thousands of years, but in the way that it has unfolded, it has been an incredibly violent endeavor to the indigenous population that didn't do anything to these people that came in as a part of initially a British settler colonial operation.
Yeah, I hear that. I mean, I guess we'll just, I look at the, the history of the state of Israel, even before the founding of the state, some decisions that were made by the various waves of Zionist immigration, and decisions that were made by, foreign powers like the United States and others. And I think I can identify possibly some pivot points where things might have developed in another way. So I don't know if I'm going to agree totally that this was all pre-baked and predetermined from the beginning. But clearly, there has been a tendency, a kind of variation of Zionism that has taken control and been in control for some decades now, that is clearly violent, that is clearly exclusivist, and is clearly eliminationist, as we're seeing in front of us. And again, I do think the U.S. bears some responsibility here, because the United States, more than any other country, has been the one that has kind of shielded Israel from any real consequences from decades and decades of these abuses. And I don't know if irony is the right word, but no country has done more to help really diminish and strangle the Israeli peace movement and the possibility of the emergence of a more pluralistic and equal, vision of the Zionist state of Israel than the United States, by shielding it from those consequences. And people like Joe Biden, whom says, there should be no daylight between the U.S. and Israel. That kind of approach has been wind at the back of the settler movement. That has been wind at the back of the extremists who are now, perpetrating this genocide.
Yeah. Okay. Let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk about Ukraine. And by the way, at any point, if you have you need to pull out, because I've already taken up a lot of your time today, you're a busy guy, you can let me know and we can end it. But what's up?
Let's talk Ukraine.
Okay. So Ukraine. Some people like Tim Pool have called it the enemy of the United States. I do not have this mindset, of course. I feel like it's been a litany of a string of policy failures overall. And I do think that there were exit ramps, but I fear that it's an unsalvageable situation that the Trump administration is making even worse than the Biden administration. What do you think is going to happen at these summits by your estimation?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly don't really know, because this summit is, let's just say Donald Trump is not a traditional foreign policy leader, to put it lightly. A summit of this kind, you would have seen at least some real work being done at the lower level by kind of lower level diplomats from both sides, to kind of hammer out an agenda and a set of kind of key, discussion points and a general expectation of what you're going to try to get out of it. Whereas Trump is just kind of charging in and saying, I want to end the war, I want to get a ceasefire. And if Putin doesn't agree to it, then, basically something bad will happen. I'll also say, I don't necessarily see that as, a criticism. I think there's sometimes good reason to do non-traditional foreign policy. When Trump with Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, back in, I think it was 2018, a lot of people criticized.
I loved it.
Bernie was one of the people who didn't.
Yeah.
It was like, we should be talking. We should be talking to our adversaries. Diplomacy is good. The question is what you get out of it.
Yeah.
And I think that's the question to have here. What is Trump hoping to get out of it? Clearly, he came into office saying, "Oh, it'll be easy to get peace in Ukraine. This will take me 24 hours. I'll go in. I'll kind of push the Ukrainians to make an agreement. I have a good relationship with Putin." He found out it's a bit more complicated than that. Even though I really didn't enjoy watching the kind of brutal treatment of Zelensky in the Oval Office, the kind of upshot of Trump really, strong arming the Ukrainians into agreeing to ceasefire talks is that he's revealed once again that Zelensky isn't the problem. Putin is the problem.
Yeah.
It's Putin's choices who are driving this war. And as far as I've seen, Putin has not really changed his goals here. And his goals are, if not necessarily to kind of occupy all of Ukraine, it's to prevent Ukraine's independence. It's to curtail Ukraine's ability to make its own foreign policy and to kind of restore Ukraine to its proper role as he sees it, as kind of this subject within the larger Russian imperium. And if that continues to be his goal, it's hard for me to see what kind of workable agreement could come out of this meeting.
Okay, that's interesting. So you said that Russia's goals in Ukraine might not necessarily be like the entire takeover of Ukraine, which I feel like is a position that other liberal foreign policy wonks would disagree with you on. I think that is. And there is like real fear, I think, from what I've seen from the Western world, liberal capitalist countries in Europe that are worried about an even further incursion of Russia. Like this is a real fear. Whether Russia has the capabilities to do so does not even matter in this equation, even though I feel like that calculation is obvious. They recognize that Russia does not have the capability to do this. Otherwise, Finland and Sweden would not have voided their handshake neutrality agreement and joined NATO. If there was a real imminent fear of Russian invasion, right? I think.
Yeah. This idea that Russia is going to take over Ukraine and then roll tanks into Poland. I mean, that's nonsense. I think the real concern, I think, is that if Russia is able to, achieve its goals in Ukraine, that creates a basis for it to, just spread its influence, its troublemaking, making its presence felt, so to speak, across Europe in a much stronger way. I think that's a legit concern. And that's why we need to kind of figure out some kind of modus vivendi with Russia. I think there were some bad choices made. On the whole, and this is where I've had, an ongoing discussion and debate with some of my brothers and sisters on the left. I think all things considered, Joe Biden handled this fairly well. I think he clearly didn't want this conflict. If you go back to 2021, I think it was June 2021, he actually had a summit with Putin. I mean, his goal for Russia was like, I want to park the Russia relationship over here. We're not going to be friends with Putin, but at least let's have some stability and clarity in the relationship. Because the Biden administration wanted to focus on China. Strategic competition with China was kind of like the obsession. It's a kind of an obsession in Washington generally, but Biden definitely reflected.
I would say started by Barack Obama. By the way, one thing that a lot of people I think fail to consider is that even when Donald Trump came into office initially, people were worried that he was going to dismantle NATO. I wasn't worried. I obviously am. I will say I am anti-NATO. For historical reasons. But the idea, the thing that they pointed to was Donald Trump's demands that NATO allies are supposed to give back more of a higher percentage of their GDP to their own defense, buy more American weapons, right? With a higher percentage of their GDP. That was actually an Obama era provision. Yeah. And Donald Trump was continuing and actually forcing the NATO partners to do that. And clearly it was such a good idea from the foreign policy uniparty mentality that Joe Biden never reversed that decision. He continued along with it as well. And I think now it's gotten to a point where Donald Trump is now demanding even more. They're talking about 5% of these countries' GDPs being spent on American weapons manufacturing. and the European partners are calling him daddy and just saying, sure, we'll do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously, U.S. defense contractors and a lot of people in the U.S. government would prefer that money be spent on U.S. weapons. But the basic demand that Obama kind of elevated was just spend the 2%, however you spend it. Yes, as an American president, I would prefer you spend a lot of this on American weapons. But the key concern was, these countries need to be spending the agreed upon amount so that they're not over reliant on the United States. It really does get back to when Donald Trump says we're being ripped off. The reason that got traction is because this is a longstanding concern amongst the American public. They feel like our, European allies are kind of free riding on money and security that the United States provides. So, I mean, you're right to bring up the fact that Obama really pressed this originally.
Yeah. And speaking of Obama, so I'm once again going to go back to Mersheimer on this issue as well. He's Mr. Realpolitik. He's a big China hawk. Obviously, I have many disagreements with him on that front. But in terms of his analysis on the relationship between the United States of America and Russia, especially as it pertains to Ukraine, I think when he identifies Ukraine as a proxy, a Western proxy, but specifically a proxy for American interests, I happen to agree with him on this. Like the interventions that have happened in Ukraine in terms of like civil society organizations and things like that is a mechanism of the American State Department. And this level of involvement starts with this like holistic, let's make Ukraine more progressive, or let's make this insert whatever country you want to more progressive. But then it's like, it turns into a way to utilize and maybe even kind of rip apart the sovereignty or whatever sovereignty that these countries might have, not just Ukraine, but every other country, at the behest of America's foreign policy interests, which would be to undermine Russia's attempts of violating Ukrainian sovereignty and bringing Ukraine into its sphere of influence. Would you disagree with that assessment?
I would disagree that, with treating Ukraine as just a proxy for the United States or for NATO. I think the Ukrainians themselves have wanted to get independence from Russia. I mean, this is a longstanding, again, just speaking as a Ukrainian myself, this is something I was raised with as well. I mean, when Russians refer to Ukrainians as our little brothers, every Ukrainian knows what that actually means. It's not a compliment. But there has been many efforts going back even before the Soviet Union to achieve Ukrainian independence, with the understanding that there are going to be strong relations between Russia and Ukraine. A lot of Ukrainians are Russian speakers first. I mean, there's obviously family relationships. There's culturally a lot that's shared, but the stuff that USAID is doing, like supporting democracy efforts, supporting civil society efforts. I mean, yes, there's an element of that where the United States obviously is looking to achieve its interests. He wants to bring countries closer to it and farther away from its adversaries. I would not just interpret that as all of this was kind of like this coherent effort just to kind of weaken Russia. I think the Ukrainians themselves have had and still have a strong desire to set up an independent, sovereign democracy. And again, that's why I've been supportive of efforts to help them defend themselves. I mean, I want this war to end. The Ukrainians want this war to end more than anyone. But I think referring to Ukraine as a proxy for the United States, really denies the Ukrainians agency in a way that I just don't think is right.
I don't disagree with you on this, by the way. Of course, I think your assessment is completely correct. I see it as converging interests. Ukrainians have always, in their national history, and you know this a lot better than I do, given your personal background, have always made their national project to be outside of the sphere of Russian influence, outside of the to have complete sovereignty. So that part I understand, and maybe along the way historically there have been some not so great attempts to do so by some Ukrainians, while the overwhelming majority of Ukrainians were busy, liberating the concentration camps. So, and it happens. I mean, the IRA also an institution that I am wholeheartedly in favor of, may or may not have in the same time frame thought that they could have allegiances with someone who is an enemy to the British Empire. I won't say who, but both the Ukrainian groups and the IRA had all found themselves in the throes of a dark allegiance, let's say. So I understand, of course, the IRA did not participate in some of the initiatives that the Ukrainian collaborators did initially. So obviously it's not to the same degree, this allegiance. But the point I'm trying to make is that, well, this is converging interest. Like, it's the same as a lot of the former Soviet bloc Eastern European countries that wanted protection and wanted to be rid of any sort of like outside influence they were getting from Moscow. Having said that, I think ultimately it almost comes down to the same things that I've said before, which is America was on the right side of this conflict. Ukraine was invaded by a much larger, irredentist regional power, Russia, unjustifiably. But America was on the right side, but it was for the wrong reasons, if that makes sense. Like, I don't think that America's ambitions, I don't think any country's ambitions are moral or immoral. I think they choose to push and pull in a direction that favors their overarching foreign policy goals. And I think a part of that, and I guess the question I'm going to ask here is, because of being on the right side, but still ultimately for the wrong reasons, and you might disagree with me on that, and we can talk about that too. Do you feel like there were exit ramps where there could have been more leverage for Ukraine that could have been entertained more? And I think you know exactly what I'm talking about, the Antalya 15-point program that was put forth after the initial pushback by Ukrainian forces and an abject failure of like the fake Russian military operation, special military operation that failed to take over Kyiv in a matter of weeks, as the initial assessment looked like.
Yeah, I mean, there was a couple things in there. One is to answer your second question first. I see there, I'm not convinced that any of these agreements, the Istanbul Agreement or any of these, subsequent agreements, I think they were worth exploring. I think some of them were explored. Could they have been explored more? Yes. But again, at no point along the way have I seen any real evidence that Putin has ultimately changed his goals. I mean, he has stated them pretty clearly, whether or not it's the physical occupation and control of all of Ukraine's territory. It's, creating a Ukrainian government that is subservient to Moscow. I think the United States definitely could have leaned in on, wanting a ceasefire and an agreement, could have leaned in on diplomacy at a few points along the way. Not necessarily because I think that would have achieved much, although that is always worth exploring, but because, again, it would have put the onus back on Putin, just as Donald Trump has done in his own way. It just made clear, like, this is the man whose choices are driving this war. And now going back to what you said about, being on the right side for the wrong reasons, I hear that. Listen, Joe Biden, I mean, even though I think he handled it fairly well, I understand he was doing this because he saw it serving the ends of American primacy. That is not a goal that I agree with. However, the way that I approached it as a progressive, who believes in people's rights to defend themselves, people's rights to independence, in international law, and the right of countries not to be invaded by their more powerful neighbors is a pretty foundational idea in international law. I mean, I saw a set of principles and values that were being upheld by a policy of the U.S. government, even if I didn't go all the way with the reasons why the U.S. government was doing that. And of course, the U.S. government is wildly hypocritical in all of these things. We look no further than Gaza to show where all those same principles and rules and laws were and are being massively violated. But I mean, people accuse you of or accuse each other of whataboutism. They're like, well, we're not doing the right thing here. Why should we do the right thing over there? My approach is I just want to be consistent about these things. The Palestinians should have self-determination and freedom, and the right not to be destroyed, just as the Ukrainians should. And I want my government to uphold those values and those principles consistently.
Yeah. A couple questions for you. I have routinely stated since the invasion that this was also a massive blunder for Vladimir Putin as well. Even though he has obviously been able to successfully gear the entirety of the Russian economy into a war economy and has been able to withstand a lot of the sanctions regime that was immediately implemented. Obviously, there's a lot of secondary markets that Russian energy can still reach Europe through, like India being one of those prime examples. And for me, even if I were to take the security concerns that Vladimir Putin might have had about like bringing Ukraine, which is right next to, like, very close to Moscow, in proximity, as opposed to like many of these other countries, like NATO encroachment. If that was like a valid concern, a valid security concern, I think the most successful way to avoid that would be to continue trade dominance and to continue engaging by way of energy trade, like European allies, and make yourself irreplaceable in a way that is not dissimilar to what China has been able to do. A less of an interest in direct intervention, but intervening in the affairs of other countries to create a security window for yourself by making sure that the bigger partners involved are still completely they're beholden to the energy partnership or the trade that you have with Russia.
Yeah.
I think not doing that and then militarily invading Ukraine was a major mistake that actually emboldened NATO, and that's the reason why you saw Finland and Sweden join NATO as well, especially because it was also a failure in terms of like a military invasion as well, which showed that Russia was wholly incapable of being a serious threat beyond the obvious nuclear threat. And that I think, I mean, the explosion of Nord Stream as well, obviously. So like there are numerous other failures here, but as it stands now, it feels like from what I have seen on the battle lines, the Russian positions hardening on eastern Ukraine, and they're making more territorial gains as well right now as we speak in the lead up to this summit. It feels like Russia sees this as having the upper hand. And I think that everything that I've read, as far as like the problems that the Ukrainian defense has, means that there is this impossible problem that Ukraine has in terms of manpower. And I don't know if there's any reasonable way to make up for that shortage, because it's not necessarily like having the most the best technology or the best like defensive or offensive weapons, or even like limiting Ukraine's like targeting capabilities of like hitting inside of Russian territory. Perhaps it could have been helpful early on, but it seems like at this stage it doesn't matter. Do you agree with that assessment, or do you feel like there's an alternative vision here that I'm not seeing?
Well, I think we're in a situation right now. I mean, first of all, going back, agreeing with you that this was initially a huge blunder and an embarrassment, and also it's put Russia in a relationship with China, which I guess I won't call a vassal relationship, but a really subservient relationship with China. That's really not something that I think Putin wanted. But he has shown the ability to reconstitute it, his military force to recruit. To strengthen over the past years with Chinese help, with Iranian help, with others' help. That is impressive. There's no other way about it. And time is on Russia's side now. I mean, I think that is the brutal reality. So that's the question we're faced with. If Putin hasn't changed his mind, what do we do? Do we say, okay, we're no longer supporting this? The United States will withdraw, or at least will lower the amount of arms and support we're willing to give. Europe will try to make up the difference. They can't do that in the short term. Everyone understands that. Slowly and then more quickly, Ukraine will start to lose. So if people understand that, then they should say so. I mean, I guess I'm not someone who has ever, kind of bought into this idea that, global democracy and American security will live or die in Ukraine. I don't think I've never wanted to kind of make these kind of wild existential claims about the importance of this conflict. As I said, I think there are important values and principles that do impact America's security and prosperity that are at play here. I don't want to overstate those. I think a lot of people do that, and it's a mistake. But I think if Putin hasn't changed his mind and still wants to achieve those goals, he will do so in the absence of continuing U.S. support.
So let's talk about a reasonable and just solution. Obviously, the most just solution in this would be the immediate cessation of hostilities, and then Russian forces pulling out of eastern Ukraine, and even taking it one step further, even like the Crimea question comes to mind. Obviously, at this stage, I think in 2025, even the American government's position is that like Crimea is a lost cause, and that the permanent annexation is if not de facto, de jure recognized, right? Like almost legally almost a legal recognition is imminent. It's also from a foreign power, an autonomous sovereign foreign power mentality. Like that reason is for Sevastopol and an entry into the Black Sea for Russia. They have their reasons for this. But having said that, I think, as you also brought up, China plays a major role in this. And I feel like the American attitude against China is actually causing us to not find the most just, most equitable solution that we could potentially get. Because I think the pathway to a meaningful resolution of this conflict also revolves around bringing China to the table. Do you disagree with that?
I don't disagree, but I think there have been efforts made to get China to play a better brokering role. I think there's been efforts by others as well. I mean, like Lula, and who took a shot at this, and I think that was great. I think we want countries like Brazil, which is a rising country, big economy, a lot of influence, especially in the developing world. I think that was really important. He wasn't able to do it. So yeah, what I understand from China's behavior is that China is right now just not really interested in doing that. I think we should continue to explore that, because if it told Putin, you're out of runway, I think that would really change the game. But as far as I can see, they have not made that decision yet.
So the reason you brought up the China-Brazil proposal, right? That's what you were referencing, because they had a joint statement on the Ukraine crisis that was delivered on May 13th. But even before then, in May 13th, 2025, but even before then, they had a joint cooperative security agreement that actually offered like limited concessions to Russia, from what I understand, and was ironically enough, in the rearview mirror, when we look at like what Trump has designed for Ukraine, a far better solution, a far more equitable outcome for Ukraine and Ukrainian independence. I guess the question that I have always is like, you say that China has no interest in this or has no investment in this, and I think you could even say that about Israel as well. China is a very significant trade partner to Israel. It could literally take action. Almost single-handedly take action against Israel if it truly wanted to, beyond stern warnings and sternly worded letters against Israel's position. But I still think that, just like with Israel, and especially with Ukraine as well, American involvement moving in one direction makes it virtually impossible. And I think it's incumbent on us to bring China to the table, is what I mean. I hear that. Because they are the senior partner in this coalition on the Russian side. and because they just love trading. They love trading more than anything else. And I think that, like, on the one hand, there's this idea that, like, Russia is seen as like the militant, like, anti-West country, the only country that has the capability to even strike a blow at whatever Western interests are, versus China is seemingly disinterested in doing that, like militarily, I mean, and therefore they're just like kicking back and watching events as they unfold, because it's, you know, it's not in they're disinterested in pushing for a reasonable solution. But the other attitude is that, like, at least historically, what China has done in contemporary Chinese history, in modern day Chinese history, they have taken a non-interventionist and a non-interventionist approach in almost every single circumstance, with the hopes that they could just, like, keep selling labubus to everyone, including in Ukraine. So if there's interest for peace from China, I feel like America could grease the wheels a little bit, or to at least, like, symbolically say, here, let's bring you to the table, if they truly were invested in a equitable outcome here.
No, I think that's right. But I would agree. I agree with pretty much everything you said, but I would add this too, from China's perspective. China benefits from the United States bleeding resources and credibility, especially in Gaza, in the Middle East, but also in Ukraine, and not being able to not being seen as able to kind of bring this war to an end. So that's kind of a cynical angle, but I do think it's a realistic part of this. But I would agree. I mean, efforts should be made. I think some have been made, but we should keep pressing, to get China involved, because it's going to have to. Ultimately, it will have to play a role in any resolution of this. But going back to what you had asked about, what does a real agreement look like? Listen, if we just cut, said, stop fighting right now, the lines are where they are, Russia retains control of, essentially the eastern third of Ukraine. Not only do I think we should go for that, I think Ukraine would go for that. The question is, okay, how is that durable? And what guarantees exist, what mechanisms exist to ensure that this is not just a pause while Russia kind of gets its shit back together and prepares for the next round of possibly even worse fighting, but just say, okay, this war is now over. Russia will retain control of these regions, Crimea, Donbass, but Ukraine will retain its sovereignty and independence.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I mean, I think, like, maybe we'll disagree on this, but I think the Minsk agreements initially were a far more favorable off-ramp if implemented correctly, or if they were actually implemented at all, as opposed to the 15-point plan in Turkey, another off-ramp, as opposed to where we're at right now, where, as you've also said, the Ukrainian the Ukrainian appetite for continuing to defend its borders militarily has completely swung in the opposite direction, with 69% of Ukrainians now saying, like, we want a ceasefire, even though the majority of Ukrainians don't think it's going to happen as well, in the same Gallup polls. Right. So, I just don't see a just or equitable outcome here for Ukraine at all, no matter what happens, unfortunately, because I just don't think that any of the Western powers are, like, genuinely interested in allowing Ukraine to have any semblance of sovereignty, and that even the European leaders who have seemingly been reliable allies to Ukraine in this process, at least in the way that they communicate on this, have done so only because they're just, like, afraid of, I guess, further Russian incursion, or what they think is, like, the American attitudes, American interests that they're relitigating. Do you feel like there is like, what do you think is going to come out of these talks? Is, I guess, what I'm going back to now that we've talked about all this.
I don't know, but I think, Trump is kind of dangling, renormalizing relationships between the United States and Russia, or at least improving those relationships. I can see how that might be attractive to Putin. Putin, sees Russia as having a kind of an historic right to play a role as a great power on the global stage. I think that is something that could potentially incentivize him to make some agreement here. That's a real deliverable for him. So again, it's possible. But the question is, okay, in exchange for that, are you willing to really give up on your kind of grand goal of, kind of destroying Ukraine's independence? Can you agree to a smaller Ukraine that is genuinely independent, that obviously is going to have closer relationships with Europe, and that has a military that can defend itself? There can be agreements made on the types and the size of weapons and all that kind of stuff. Um, but I think that's kind of the most realistic, decent outcome at this point. But I'm kind of skeptical that we'll see it in the next couple of days, although maybe the groundwork could start to be laid for those, talks to progress.
Um, do you think that Russia has the capacity to hold militarily eastern Ukraine, or do you think that there will be a lot of impossible American-style counterinsurgency initiatives that they will have to do, which will make it virtually impossible for them and will inevitably cripple their economy and will consistently be a headache from their perspective, from the Russian perspective, because of the understandable desire that Ukrainian elements will have in the region if they still are living there to consistently fight back against Russian forces?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like I said, Russia has shown the ability to recruit and to reconstitute kind of its material, and it also, has no compunction about fighting a pretty savage war. And that would be a pretty savage counterinsurgency. But as we've seen, savage counterinsurgencies often fail, and they produce the exact opposite outcome, precisely because they're so savage. I don't know. I think partly that would, we'd have to see what kind of agreement was made for the rest of Ukraine. If there's the possibility, people picking up and leaving, the homes and communities that they've lived in for generations for the other part of Ukraine, if they want to stay Ukrainian, is not the best outcome. Forcing people to leave either voluntarily or not is always pretty brutal. But again, I think that the nature of any counterinsurgency would kind of hinge on what the rest of Ukraine looks like and what its future looks like.
Yeah. Okay. Well, last question for you. You said some stuff about communism and specifically about China. I wanted to hear you, because I'm unfamiliar with your position on China, and we might be somewhat at odds on this. But I wanted to see what you currently think about modern China. Is it a danger? Is it going to be a more moderating force as a hegemonic power in the future? Is it already there? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly, a major power. It's the closest, competitor to the United States. My view is that strategic competition leads one place, and that's to conflict. I think adopting strategic competition as the lens through which we approach the relationship and we approach all of foreign policy is a huge mistake, and I'm against it. And two of my colleagues at CIP, Mike Brennis and Van Jackson, wrote a book earlier this year called The Rivalry Peril, which I highly recommend, which is a book-length argument for why strategic competition is the wrong approach and offers a better approach, which basically recognizes that, listen, we need to find a way to coexist with China. We have a lot of shared interests. We certainly face a lot of shared challenges, whether it's climate, pandemics, run down the list that the United States and China absolutely have to try to find a way to work together on. There's just no way around it. It'll be frustrating. It'll often fail, but we have to keep trying to do it because we're both major powers in the world. So kind of designing U.S. foreign policy around, holding China's economy down or simply defining China as an adversary to kind of America's freedom of action is not only counterproductive, it won't work, and it will also have like really negative political consequences here in the United States. It will power authoritarianism in the United States, just as the obsession with kind of Islamic terrorism did in the United States. I mean, Donald Trump himself is a consequence of our, it's a consequence of a lot of things in American politics. But one of the things was, America's global war on terror. He is part of that blowback.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do we agree?
Well, I mean, I think I do think that yes, cooperation is an absolute necessity, and I would love for America to do that. Or even if they were going to compete with China, they should become more Chinese in terms of central planning and building a robust manufacturing base here in this country instead of engaging in like idiotic trade protectionist arguments that don't have any trade to protect really, and treating global allies, like historic allies, whether it be our most consequential trade partners like Mexico and Canada, or even Europe, as vassal states, and demanding more tithing from them. And they are seemingly servile, because what are they supposed to do? They clearly don't want Chinese influence. They're also terrified of Chinese influence in the same way that like Americans are.
No, I mean,
in the same way that the American state is, rather. And so they're not pushing back at all. I mean, with the exception of Mexico, I would say Mexico is obviously
they define their entire security concept around an America that will never change and will always kind of pick up the check and provide the umbrella. And it's very hard to shift a boat like that when you've have an entire generation or multiple generations of bureaucrats and who've thought about it in this way. No, but what you said about central planning. America has started to actually do industrial policy now. I think that is one of the things I think the Biden administration deserves some credit for, is like really getting the memo on the post-neoliberal moment. I mean, it took far too long to land. We should have, there were a lot of us. I mean, my own entry into politics was in the late 90s alter globalization movement, the protests against the World Bank, the IMF, WTO, and I think those protests were right, and it took over 20 years for Washington to realize they were right. But now, you have a Biden administration that was like, okay, neoliberalism, all these kind of religious beliefs that the power of the free market didn't actually work out. So we need to rethink the role of the government in the economy. And I think that's important. But I do think if we are going to kind of point that toward holding China down or going back to this play, as you said, what Trump is doing is just using trade as a weapon to punish our enemies and exact tribute. That doesn't lead to a better, more equitable global trade system. That leads to conflict.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think Biden initiated first steps in the right direction in terms of like industrial policy, but I do also think that it was very it was classic Democratic Party, too little, too late, and also never implemented and almost entirely inadequate at the end. And not never implemented, but like inadequate at the end of the day. When I say like central planning, I mean making demands out of companies that we are subsidizing and saying like, you do not exist without taxpayer funded subsidies. And therefore, when we say you're going to produce more, or rather when we say you are going to have every single worker that works in these factories become unionized employees, and there's going to be sectoral bargaining, and allow labor to thrive in America. That's what I mean when I talk about like centrally planned economy. And I feel like that is, I mean, it seems impossible to implement in this country at this stage, and it's becoming even more impossible by the day with Donald Trump's decisions.
Oh, I hear you, but I mean, I would agree. I mean, it was not nothing, but it was too little, and it took far too long. But I think they have opened up a debate, long overdue, about the appropriate role of the government in the economy, and it's up to, I think, the rest of us to kind of really pry that open, and to force it open and have a better debate.
Yeah. Well, Matt Duss, thank you so much for coming on. This was a wonderful and enlightening conversation. I hope I didn't press you too hard on some of these things.
Thank you.
And I hope to have you back on the broadcast soon.
All right. Anytime.
All right, bye.
Bye.
Chatters, you have misbehaved this entire time. That was shocking. It was alarming how badly you were misbehaving. Okay. It's perfectly healthy to have a back and forth. It's not supposed to be just a straight up interview. Okay. There's a reason why, there were points where I was talking without asking a complete question. Okay. In terms of like American foreign policy, Matt Duss and his perspective is considered radical. Like the Center for the Center for International Policy is like one of the few, alongside the Quincy Institute, that is seen as like insane in DC. Okay. Like some of you literally looked at what he's saying and you're like, well, we don't agree. We don't align. But like, you have to understand, that's like even his positions are like impossible. Like they're like things that you consider to be unconscionable in your understanding of the world. Like things that you and I agree on that we might disagree with Matt Duss on are not even a point of the conversation at all. That like his framework and the way, like what he is saying, what he's advocating for is seen as like insanely radical by DC types. I hope you understand that. Everyone in foreign policy is liberal. Yeah, I mean, that is also true, yes.